So very specific is very much a euphemism in this case. So the first thing I'm going to say is, I know that for a lot of you, you have a lot of questions about Islam. You want to know stuff. You want to ask me this stuff. The only thing I'm going to ask, I'm going to give a lot of time for Q&A, so don't worry about that. The only thing I ask is that your question is less than a minute long and ends with a question mark that isn't, what do you think of all that I just said? So, if you want to tell me about yourself, that's what the Bat Cruise is for. We can talk more there. But for purposes of the other audience members, it would be helpful if we made questions to be actual questions. And I've been that person before, and to my past fellow audience members, I apologize. So I'm going to be talking about what I call virgins, raisins, and sexy serving boys. So this is female sexuality in Islam. And it's a talk I've given before, but there's always more to say, especially when you have more time to say it. And lots of interesting, awesome people in weird Austin to talk about it with. So the discourse surrounding Muslim female sexuality, it really focuses a lot of the time on women as objects. And I'm not just talking about Muslims here. I'm not just talking about Islamic teachings. I'm talking about even when non-Muslims look at it, they tend to think of women as these sort of passive vessels or these objects or these representations of oppression that they can talk about as opposed to full human beings. So one example is when people talk about the repression or suppression of Muslim women. They'll say things like, if Kim Davis went to get a driver's license and the person was Muslim, she wouldn't be able to get a driver's license, ha. Even though there is one country in all the Muslim countries in the world where women are not allowed to drive. But they take that one example and suddenly it becomes Muslims don't believe that women can drive, which is not patently false. I mean, even the most fundamentalist people in my family, their wives all drive. It's not a problem. We all got our licenses when we were 16, or in my case 17, because I flunked my driver's test more times than I care to admit. There's also the comment that Islam is regressive in their attitudes towards women. And I always ask, what do you mean by regressive? What are we regressing to? What is our point of comparison? One example I can bring up is left-handedness. So I don't know if you all heard the news about the teacher that forced the kid to use their left hand instead of their right hand. So there was a teacher in the United States who sent a note home with the kid saying, left-handedness is evil and considered sinister, so we're forcing the kid to use right hand. And everywhere, all the blog posts, all the tweets were all, what century do we live in? And I remember, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, in my family, left-handedness was still considered to be a bad thing. And to this day, it's considered to be a bad thing, because in Islam, eating with your left hand, we were always told, if you eat and drink with your left hand, all the nutrition goes to Satan. Talk about a diet plan. Let's all just eat with our left hands, no worries. Keep that in mind for later at the Bat Cruise, right? If you drink with your left hand, maybe Satan is the one who gets the buzz. But would we really want that? I don't think so. But this idea that, there's a fixed point in history where things used to be bad and we've moved past there, and anybody who acts outside of what we do now has to be regressing to this mysterious time where everybody was mean. It's so entirely American-centric, and it's so white American-centric. It's not looking at society as a whole. There's also the idea of dress codes. There's been a lot of furor in the United States over dress codes. You know who else thinks shoulders are sexy and appealing and enticing and make men go mad? The Taliban. But please don't go around the United States telling people who think that, because if they teamed up, we're all screwed. Never tell the fundies how much they have in common. There's also a real obsession and focus on the female body. So, and a lot of that, of course, has to do with the fact that in Islam, women have to cover up more of their bodies than men do. But a lot of it is just this obsession with controlling or not controlling the female body. In fact, I went to an atheist conference several years ago, and I won't say which one or when it was, and I definitely won't say who said this, but a certain esteemed speaker had a slide that had a picture of Muslim women who were covered up, and he said, in some places in the world, they stuff women into bags and beat them. I remember sitting there and thinking, bags? Some of these women are wearing, they're wearing garments, they're not wearing bags. And you see these memes comparing, body coverings to trash bags. How is that in any way helping Muslim women? How is that in any way aiding them in understanding and overcoming any sort of repressive laws that are going on? It's putting them down, it's dehumanizing them, and it's reducing them to just their bodies. It's saying, because we can't see your body, you're not a person. Which is just as bad as saying, just because you're showing your body, I consider you less than a person. There are also headscarf and face covering bans. So in France, they're always trying to ban some aspect of Muslim women covering themselves. They started with the face coverings, and then they moved on to the head coverings, and now there was a Muslim girl who was sent home for wearing a long skirt, which on a white girl would have been considered hippie chic. But on a brown girl, she's a fundamentalist who needs to put on a mini skirt so that she can show she's sufficiently secular to be attending public school. It's so counterintuitive too, because if you ban the clothing that Muslim women sometimes prefer and sometimes are forced to wear, where are they going to go? You're just going to force them to stay home. It's not like their fathers or husbands are suddenly going to say, go ahead, put on that mini skirt and go, now that the law says you have to. So the focus, again, is on the body and on sort of women women as objects, instead of allowing women to sort of have their own agency. When I used to wear a headscarf, people would pull me aside, often little old ladies, and they would pat me on the shoulder and say, dear, you don't have to wear that here, right? And I'd say, well, maybe, what are we talking about here? I had never lived in any other country in my life. I was born and raised in the United States, so I thought, okay, if not here, where would I be wearing it? What country do you expect me to? And as a matter of fact, my ethnic origins, most of those people don't cover up the way that I was covering up, so it wasn't really relevant anyway. What it comes down to is a denial of agency, a denial of humanity, a denial of the full person. You can't really force people to choose the freedom that you prefer. You can't say, if you don't wear this kind of clothing, you're clearly repressed and oppressed, and I'm freer than you. Where do we draw the line? Is it the more naked you are, the more free you are, or is it the other way around? I mean, if you talk to certain second wave feminists, that's not true. If you're wearing something that shows your body, then they think you're oppressed by the male gaze. So you have to really think about it sort of contextually. There is a slippery slope, too, with the idea of that's not her choice. And I'm not denying that in certain parts of the world there are laws that actually mandate women to wear headscarves and face coverings. And I'm not denying that there's social pressure on a lot of these women to cover up anywhere in the world, even the United States. But oppressive societal structures are everywhere. You can't just point at one and say, this is the one that we're going to decide is evil and bad, and nobody can do this thing. There's soft pressure versus hard pressure. There's legal pressure, there's religious pressure, which I'd consider to be more on the hard side of things, and then there's the soft pressure. So one example in the United States is shaving your legs if you're a woman. No law is forcing you to, but there might as well be one. Because God forbid someone sees your legs and they're not completely smooth. You're nasty and disgusting and unhygienic, and you'll never hear the end of it. And I know this personally. Social pressures, even though they're softer, even though no one's going to throw me in jail for having unshaved legs, at the same time, those are really hard to get rid of. It's really hard to convince people that what they've been taught from birth is not true when nobody's being killed over it. If you can point at dead people, you can say, well, people are being killed over it. They'll say, well, okay, then maybe let's reconsider. But if no one's dying over it, obviously that's a step up in as far as the body count, but it's hard to convince people that it's wrong if there's no body count, essentially. There's also a Western savior complex that exists with a lot of people. It's the idea that someone from the United States or Britain, usually some sort of Anglophone country, is going to come in to save these poor non-white people from their own problems that they themselves have. And not only that, he's better than them at their own good native arts. Some of the best examples come from film. Avatar, not the TV show, which is excellent. Avatar, the terrible James Cameron movie. Fern Gully, The Last Samurai, Dances with Wolves. You know, this shining white knight comes into this dark culture, and they have certain good arts, and he learns them. But somehow he's better than these people who've been trained from birth to do that exact thing, just magically. And then he saves everybody from themselves, and he saves some girl from a forced marriage or something, and, you know, rides away in triumph, and he is now their leader. You know, these notions are ridiculous when I describe them like this, but people have them in their heads. And if you add gender problems to the mix, it goes to a whole other level. I, once upon a time, was the only actual teenage girl on the internet. Not some guy pretending to be one. I was actually on there. And there were men who, when they found out what I was, a headscarf Muslim girl, you know, trapped at home, had these weird ideas. They tell me, oh, I think of you as a princess locked up in a tower and I'm going to come save you. And I'm just thinking, what, me? No, you're thinking of somebody else. But it happens a lot with this sort of fetishization of you're oppressed and I'm going to free you. And it's not freeing you so you can have your own agency in your own life and your own say. It's freeing you and you'd better be grateful and keep your bitch mouth shut. And you definitely get that from certain people, cough, cough, in the atheist movement, cough, cough, who anytime you try to have better rights for any oppressed group, but especially women, they bring up these other countries and say, oh, well, it's worse over there, so shut up. Okay, so are you threatening me to make things worse? Are you saying if you don't shut up and you don't do as I say, then we're going to make it worse for you? It's this sort of implied threat. A lot of ex-Muslim women and I are friends, and we share the dating messages that we get. And you get these people saying things like, oh, it's so great you left Islam. How's your clitoris? Is it still there? Or, oh, it's so great you left Islam. How many men have you had sex with since then? Are you still pure? Can I be your first? This is not uncommon or rare. This is ridiculously common. There's a reason I don't have my ethnicity marked on my dating profile and I do not have ex-Muslim on there anymore, because the weirdos just come flooding in. Some of them will say things like, oh, you know, do you still have any of your headscarves? Do you want to wear one during? I tried that once. It was actually less fun than you might imagine. It gets really warm under there. There's also this, and it sort of ties into, if you want another example of this exoticization or fetishization, there's these men who in the United States say, oh, well, women in the United States are too liberated and they're not feminine enough, and so they have all these dating sites importing brides from Russia or China or Korea or the Philippines, or even the informal system that exists in my family of these, you know, American-raised men in my family going back home to import a bride, because they'll consider her to be more docile, more obedient. It's less about freeing someone and more about having someone who you think might be grateful to you for the small amount of freedom you're going to allow her. And it mirrors what goes on in Islam, because you hear people saying, oh, in those countries they do those things to their women. Not women suffer under these oppressions or women are not allowed to be free. Look what they do to their women, as if women are possessions rather than people. And Muhammad had sayings like, you can tell the state of a society by its women. He'd say things like, you know, the less clothing a woman is wearing in any given society, that's how you tell the morality. And we have that standard too, but we think the less clothing the woman's wearing in a society, the more free the society must be. Muhammad also said that there are more women than men in hell because women complain too much about their husbands. You know, not to talk about the higher murder rate that men have. No, that's okay. That's not going to put more men in hell. No, it's totally fine, right? It plays into what these men claim to be against, which is seeing female sexuality only in relation to men and women as property of men. You know, instead of, you know, talking to Muslim women, maybe trying to actually relate to other human beings as human beings, it becomes this game of who's better and who's worse and who's more free and who's not. Muhammad did this too. What a lot of Western people don't realize is that Muhammad used to compare his laws to the laws that came before him and say, it was so much worse back then, look at how much better you have it now. And since history is written by the victors, we don't actually know much of the truth of what the Arabian culture was like towards women before Muhammad. We have some hints though, some hints of women as business people and poets and leaders, but Muhammad claimed that all they did in pre-Islamic Arabia was bury their newborn girls at birth. He claimed that they would have sexual slaves who they would share, and that, girls would be married off without even their permission being asked. So Muhammad's upgrade to these rules was, don't bury your newborn girls, which is a pretty good thing. But he decided that sexual slavery should be limited. So men could only have sex with the slaves who they owned. So you couldn't pass around a slave girl because that would be, undignified and mean to her. But you could have sex with her, no problem. And that's in addition, by the way, to the 4 wives. The 4 wives are their own thing, and then there's concubines and slaves, which are unlimited in number. Don't ever tell that to a Muslim. They'll say, oh, you just don't know, you're misinterpreting. They're wrong, it's in there. Citation to come. Also, Muhammad decided that girls should be asked their opinion about whom they marry. But then someone said, oh, what if she doesn't say anything? He said, her silence is her consent. And we see mirroring of that in modern society where they say, well, she didn't say no. Well, maybe if she was passed out because you roofied her, she couldn't say no. But it's this idea of an absence of a no being taken as a yes, and it's in there in Islam and it's in there in our culture. There's very little discussion of sexuality in Islam in a way that's about desire and passion and agency and consent. It's really all about legalese. Who can you fuck legally? And it's men. It's always about men. Men are prohibited from having sex with most of their close blood relatives. They're also not supposed to have sex with anyone who's related to them through wet nursing. Wet nursing was a thing they did a lot more often back then, where they'd have a child breastfeed with someone else. And if you breastfed off someone, she was like your mother and her children were like your siblings. So you weren't supposed to marry them. Which actually led to an Egyptian scholar to jokingly, people didn't realize it was a joke, so there was a big global furor over this. He claimed that in order to facilitate faculty interactions at his university without purity and modesty laws, that there should be symbolic breastfeeding between members of the faculty so that they wouldn't have to worry about not shaking each other's hands or doing other things that weren't allowed in Islam. And of course there was a big uproar, and he said, I was kind of being facetious here, but In Islam, though, your relatives do not include, they are your relatives, but you can marry them. Your cousins, your uncles by marriage, and your siblings-in-law. So growing up, as soon as I hit puberty, I couldn't hug my boy cousins anymore. I couldn't hug my uncles who were married to my biological aunts. And if any of my siblings were to get married, by Islamic law, I'm not supposed to be, hugging or anything with those relatives. So it sort of oddly sexualizes those relationships when you can't even hug them, because what if you could marry them someday? A Muslim woman, on the other hand, she's prohibited from having sex with a man who doesn't have an Islamic marriage contract with her, or who isn't her owner, she's a slave. So that's all. That's it, bottom line. And slavery is also considered to be part of the bounties of war. So if they capture the enemy camp and there are women, then at that point the women are automatically considered to be slaves, at least for a time period. So yeah, that's not super encouraging. It's not super enlightened. It's not the best. But some people have sort of reimagined what these things mean. So there's one rule in Islam that's sort of odd, where if you get married to someone and you get a divorce, because divorce is allowed. It's not encouraged, but it's allowed. If you have a divorce with someone and you want to get remarried to them, they have to get married to someone else before you can legally marry them again. And I have had some more open-minded Muslims refer to it as the swingers clause. And I have heard, I don't know how accurate this is, but there are stories that swirl even the people in Muhammad's time or right after that claim that they kind of used it to their advantage. It's like, hey, let's like switch off for a while and then we can switch back. It'll be great. There's also the 4 witnesses thing, which is for adultery. You have to have 4 witnesses who have some sort of evidence and are willing to testify against someone to validate charges of adultery. And I've heard these same sort of liberal, progressive Muslims claim it's a privacy loophole. You can have all the extra or premarital sex you want. Just make sure 4 people aren't willing to go to bat and say that you did. As I mentioned before, Muslim men are allowed to have up to 4 wives and unlimited concubines and slaves. Concubines are usually considered to be non-Muslim women, and slaves are Muslim or not, they're just slaves. But there's a lot of talk about male sexual desire in Islam. There's a lot of stories of Muslim men coming up to Muhammad and saying, I'm really horny. I really need to get laid. And Muhammad would say, well, why don't you get married? And they'd say, well, I can't really support a wife. His answer, fast. Just fast, sunrise to sunset, no food or water. You get tired really quick. The last thing on your mind generally is sex. Then there's the polygyny thing, the multiple wives. But what a lot of people fixate on, especially after 9/11, is the 42 virgins thing. 72, sorry, not 42. 42 is life, the universe, and everything. 72 is allegedly the number of heavenly virgins you get. And people get really confused and say, why 72? That's an oddly specific number. It's actually not that specific. It's like me saying, if I told you once, I told you 1,000 times. 1,000 is not literally, I sat and counted how many times I said this thing to you. So 72 is supposed to be limitless, bountiful, amazing. And then people wonder, oh, but after you have sex with them, they're not virgins anymore. Think Aphrodite in Greek mythology. These virgins are eternally, renewably virgin. And then people say, well, what if you want 72 skanks? What if you want 72 people who know what they're doing as opposed to virgins? And they're forgetting that there's a historical context for this, because even in Western culture, sex with an untouched woman is considered to be the height of sexual bliss and the best thing you could ever have. So it's not so much 72 eternally renewable virgins so much as the best sex you will ever have forever. This is your reward in life for never drinking and never having any fun. And then, of course, there are the people who bring up this completely debunked thing. There was some French historian who claimed that virgins was mistranslated and it was actually white raisins. That's complete bunk. If you know anything about linguistics, he was wrong. He was some French guy making something up. I'm sorry, that's just the truth. Now, to go deeper a little bit into the heavenly wives thing, so they're called houris, or huralain in Arabic. They not only are considered to be the height of sexual pleasure, they were also considered to be sort of a way to check Muslim women. So there are sayings of Muhammad where he would talk about the houris and how if a man was mistreated by his wife on earth, the houris in heaven are looking down at her and admonishing her, you only have him for a short period, he's going to be ours forever. Don't mistreat him. Can anybody say male fantasy? Now, what happens to Muslim women when they die? I was worried about it as a Muslim. You know, I was a good girl. I hadn't even shaken hands with a man since puberty, let alone had sex. And when the libido kicked in at puberty, and I remember thinking, well, I don't want to die a virgin and then never get to have sex. That just seems sad. That just wouldn't be fair if I were to die young. And the Quran's only explicit mentions of women in heaven are about either the houris, which I was not one and I knew it, because the houris are actually created in heaven just for sex. They're sex bots. That's what they're there for. They're not earthly women who become magically beautiful. The Quran mentions the women of heaven as reclining on couches, eating. But they are being served by beautiful, clear-eyed servant boys. And there is a lot of speculation among a lot of Muslim women as to what the extent of the uses of these servant boys are. And in fact, in Shiite Islam, in Iran especially, they will explicitly say to women that, if you die on the warpath of Allah, you'll get beautiful men to serve you sexually for all eternity. I guess that's more egalitarian. I guess that's more forward-thinking in that way. But the idea of just reclining on a couch eating forever, I mean, that sounds pretty good, but not the best, especially if, as a teenager, a really horny virgin teenager, I didn't want to just eat forever. I could have done that on Earth, right? I wanted to get laid. But because it didn't seem like Islam explicitly had anything for me, I remember thinking I must be gay, which is true a little bit. Or I must be a guy, which is not true. But I wondered, why do I have this libido that Islam didn't really seem to address? I found out many years later as an atheist that there are some interpretations of Islam that believe that women, if you die without a husband, or if you don't get your husband after you die, because there is a clause in Islam where if a man goes to heaven and he calls for his wife on earth, she can join him with his harem of lovelies. But if he doesn't call her, if a woman dies without getting married, or if she dies and her husband is not a Muslim and can't go to heaven, then she might be assigned to one of the many prophets and holy men of the past. I knew exactly which one I wanted. I know the story of Joseph is in the Bible, and I don't know if this part of it is in the Bible. I think it's only in the Quran. I think it's one of those fan fiction things that Muhammad added in because, I don't know, he wanted to spice up the story a little bit. Apparently, Joseph was so damn hot that of all the beauty that Allah had ever created, so this includes things like galaxies or shooting stars or sunsets, people, adorable cats, every bit of beauty in the universe, if you put it into a space and you cut it in half, Joseph got half of it. So I remember thinking when I found that out, damn, like if I had died still a Muslim virgin, like I could have been assigned to Joseph after I died. Missed out on that one. So I want to sort of bring about, and there are even Muslim activists doing this, a shift in the conversation from women in relation to men and more into women and their own feelings and desires and what they think. So how do Muslim women feel about this? You'd have to ask the Muslim woman. It really depends. There's so many interpretations. People take religions into their own hands, especially Sunni Muslims, because Shiite Muslims have more of a hierarchy. Sunni Muslims are sort of free-for-all, do whatever you want, like Protestants in a lot of ways. And so there are a lot of Muslims who sort of take these things into their own hands and come up with their own ideas. I kind of did that. I mean, thinking about Joseph as a future husband, or even polygyny's potential benefits for me. Growing up in my family, nobody in our recent history in our family had multiple wives. It was just not done. And whenever it came up, everyone in my family would say things like, oh, if my husband ever did that, I would divorce him right away. And I remember thinking, I don't know, I feel like sharing the duties might be a decent thing. It may not be such a bad thing. Because I wanted to grow up and work and write and do all kinds of cool things, but as a Muslim woman, I would be expected to have children as well. And I thought, if we marry someone who's more of a housewife, then, she could take care of the kids and stuff, and me and the husband could go out and earn the halal bacon. And I had this whole idea in my head of a nice little family where, we'd come home and help her bathe the kids and put them all to bed, and we'd all snuggle on the couch, and it would be so great. As it turned out, really what I wanted was a housewife. That's what I wanted. And as I mentioned before, the four witnesses thing has been reinterpreted to be a privacy thing as opposed to a thing that's against women. And hijab, the headscarf, a lot of Muslim women see it less as controlling men's desires and more about controlling who gets to see them and who doesn't. I mean, as a chubby kid with frizzy hair living in Southern California, I loved having to cover myself up. It was better than having my body at the scrutiny of everybody. I mean, I got called fat enough. Imagine if people had been able to actually see my body. It would have been worse for me. And it has become worse for me. And in Southern California, from the time I was little till now, there exists what I call flat iron fascism. Nobody wants to have frizzy hair. Everyone wants to have flat ironed hair. And I like the fact that I didn't have to do that. I put it in a bun, put a scarf over it, called it a day. I didn't have to deal with it. I'm hardly the only person to have ever done that. There's Irshad Manji, who's a Canadian lesbian Muslim. And there's a verse in the Quran where Allah said that he created everything in the universe to be perfect. And her interpretation of that is, God clearly made me to be a lesbian, so I'm perfect and I'm fine the way I am. And a lot of Muslims sort of roll their eyes at that, but it is sort of a way to reinterpret all that. There is also no specific prohibition in Islam against female masturbation. None whatsoever. The same goes for lesbianism. They're really obsessed about what dudes are doing. Are men wasting their seed? Or are men having sex with men? But for women, they're like, oh, well, women don't really have libidos, right? We don't have to worry about that. No worries. The only real injunction against either male or female masturbation is the adultery laws. There's a verse in the Quran about who you can and can't have sex for, and they say you should reserve your genitals for the use of your spouse. And so some people say, well, that means you can't masturbate. And I remember thinking, but don't you get pleasure out of the sex too? Can you not get pleasure from sex if by that logic? And then there are people doing more work on the ground. There's Shireen El-Feki, who wrote a book called Sex in the Citadel. She went around interviewing Egyptian women of all ages, from the oldest grandma to the youngest child, about their sexuality and their relationship to their body. And it's a really interesting read. And she talks about, the differences and how throughout this sort of informal history of Egypt that she does, there have been more conservative times and more liberal times. It went all over the place. There's also a scholar named Geraldine Brooks who did The 9 Parts of Desire, which is considered to be the first real study of Muslim women and their sexualities. There's also a great blog called Love Inshallah. Inshallah means if Allah wills it. And they have a book and a blog, and Muslim women talk about their feelings and experiences. And there's activists named Wadad Luta and Heba Khatib, and they do these sex advice shows. And some of them have even started opening up halal sex shops. So Muslim shops that sell marital aids, as they call them. No dildos allowed, but there are things like massage oils or, lingerie, things like that. And then, of course, there's the Islamic erotica. The first one I ever heard of, I haven't read it yet, I've heard mixed things about it. It's called The Almond, and it was written by a pseudonymous woman who talks about the sex she has. But probably the funniest one, and the one that I have read, is a book called Between Sisters SVP. And SVP stands for S'il vous plaît, if you please. And it's the title is supposed to be a warning. She even has a warning at the beginning, like, men shouldn't be reading this. This is only for women, and also only if you're a married woman. Okay, let's move on to the raunch. And the woman's name is Papatia. She has this really weird French last name I'm not even going to try to say. It's a pseudonym, and the book, the premise of the book is that this woman is married, but she has 3 sister wives. And this woman is claiming that she's spying on these sister wives having sex with her husband, and she's like describing it in great detail. And the big twist at the end is they're all her. They're just different aspects of her personality. There's the sweet one, and the sassy one, and the kinky one, and the motherly one. Yeah, don't read it. If you want to know more, we can talk about it later. There's a lot of label whoring in the book. She talks about what brand of clothing and eyeliner she's wearing every single time. It's almost like capitalist erotica. I can afford Lancome everything and Louis Vuitton this. But still, it's sort of an expression and a creativity of Muslim female sexuality that people don't think exists, but it clearly does. There are also progressive and LGBT Muslim groups. There was a group called Muslim Wake Up. They were active for a short period and they're gone now. But now there are Muslim groups called Masjid, which is the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity. Intentionally done that way. I actually worked with them at Creating Change, the big LGBT conference that's every year, and I've been in contact with them. So they're really trying to do things differently. Although it was funny because when I had lunch with them, I wanted to get the Cobb salad, but I didn't because it had bacon on it. And when I get to the table, one of them is just calmly eating that Cobb salad with the bacon on it. I thought you were supposed to be the Muslim group and I'm the atheist. No, not how it happened. So what does all this mean, all this stuff I talked about? I think it's really important to allow for Muslim women to speak for and decide for themselves about their sexualities and their bodies. Radical notion, I know. And we should be staying away from patronizing assumptions. We should be encouraging a general attitude that is pro-female agency and not buying into Islam's erasure, because whenever we say, oh, Muslim women are oppressed or Muslim women don't have a voice, we're just buying into what Islam says about women. And if we really want to be progressive egalitarian, that's not really what we're trying for. And we should also, and this is a little more controversial, encourage progressive efforts within Islam. And that is not necessarily what a lot of atheists think. A lot of them think, oh, we should deconvert them all. That's not going to happen, I'm sorry. That's not how it's going to work. I mean, eventually there's probably going to be more and more non-religious people. But in the world we live in right now, encouraging progressive people is really going to encourage less harm. And in my view, harm reduction is really the most important thing. It's the most pragmatic thing in my view. And we should discourage the stripping away of female agency. Islam is one part of what needs to change for radical gender equality. We need to frame women as subjects rather than objects of their sexuality. And also trust that Muslim women, no matter how religious, are probably already doing it for themselves. The best example I can give you is from when I was a teenager. The Muslim Student Alliance or Union, depending on where you are, it's MSA or MSU, they do a big conference, one East and one West, just like the Secular Student Alliance, quite the same. And one year it was at the university that was in my hometown. So even though I was just a high schooler and I hated the MSA people at my high school and wasn't part of it, I decided to go anyway. So my cousin and I went, and we were watching the people go by. And there's a saying that Muhammad has that the first gaze is for you, the second gaze is the sin, which means that if you look at someone and you're attracted to them, that first glance is not your fault. It's accidental. But the second gaze is the sin. So, you got to keep your eyes fixed on them to make that first gaze count. So that's exactly what we were doing. We were boy watching at the MSA conference, and me surreptitiously girl watching. I can't speak for my cousin here. I didn't say anything to her about that, though. That's a whole other kettle of, I don't know what, fish. That's a bad joke. I'm sorry. So we were looking at boys, and we came up with a rating system for boys. Based on the very Islamic phrases of Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, and MashaAllah. MashaAllah means like what has Allah created, like it's a sign of appreciation. Alhamdulillah literally means thank you, Allah. Subhanallah means all praise be to Allah, and Allahu Akbar means Allah is the greatest. And that was top ranking. Top ranking boys made us go Allahu Akbar. So this is what we were doing at the Muslim conference, despite my cousin growing up into someone who married literally at the age of 18, like the second she turned 18, and covering her face and pumping out 3 kids real quick. And I was very religious at the time and stayed religious for a while. But even as fundamentalist religious as we were, we found a way to be silly teenagers giggling over cute boys. And if that can happen, I think it can happen with any Muslim teen. Alrighty, so let's open this up to any questions. Your hand went up right away.
Yeah, we have a perception in the West about honor killings, how common they are and how global they are.
Mm-hmm.
Is our perception right, or
So the question was in regards to honor killings and the perception of their commonality and things like that. I would say in Western countries it's not super common. It's happened a couple of times. It usually happens in cultures where they already kind of have that idea of honor, obviously. It's not necessarily a Muslim phenomenon. It varies from country to country. So in the Indian subcontinent, they tend to do acid attacks more than anything. And this is true even among Hindus. Even non-Muslims will do this, where if a girl turns down a proposal or her sister's seen with a man from the wrong class or something like that, they'll throw hydrochloric acid on her and disfigure her for life. And it's a horrible problem. It's a really big problem. But if you go to other countries, there's more straight up murders. Or if you go to other countries, it's other things. But the phenomenon of honor killing, honestly, can be most feasibly and understandably compared to the phenomenon of women being murdered by their partners or former partners in the United States. It's a real epidemic. And people don't like to talk about it because it's, makes men look bad. But it's very true that in the United States, it's really common to be killed by your partner or former partner, or at least face some sort of violence from them. And so there is clearly a problem with this idea of that men own women and should have control over them and should be able to harm them when they don't do as they will. And I would say that that's sort of, obviously it's on a different level and it's in a different way. But yeah, it's not uncommon. There's no question there. And it's a big problem, and it's something that is worth combating and looking at. Beth?
So if a man has multiple wives in Islam, are there any specific prohibitions on group sexual activity?
Of course you'd ask that, Beth. So Beth is asking if there's a prohibition on group sex if you are a Muslim man married to multiple wives. Unfortunately, yes. There are modesty rules. You're supposed to, there are even some Muslims who believe that you can't have sex naked if you're not under a sheet, because you're like donkeys running in the street. Like, you're supposed to at least be wearing some clothing or be under a sheet. Now, there are plenty of Muslims who say, hell no, we fuck wherever we want. After marriage, it's all okay. It's all halal now. But there's some Muslims who don't think so. I mean, obviously stuff like that probably happens. Like, I know it happens. I know some people who told me it happens. And there were definitely ideas in my head growing up about what I would do with my co-wives. But yeah, technically, I don't think you're supposed to. But who knows? People get up to what they want.
At least in the form of Judaism that I was brought up in, I was always told that it's a double mitzvah, a double blessing to have sex on the Sabbath with your married partner. Is there a version
So is there a version of the double mitzvah of sex on the Sabbath in Islam as there is in Judaism? The holy day of Friday in Islam isn't as big of a deal as the holy days in Judaism. So, Friday is the afternoon prayer, and it's a community meeting. It's a way for people to get together, and that's supposed to be mandated on all men. But it's not a holy time necessarily as much. But, my mom made a big deal about the fact that all three of us, me and my brother and my sister, were all born on Fridays. So maybe if you were conceived on a Friday, it might be a big deal too. I was also born in Ramadan, so I was a Friday and a Ramadan baby, and look where it landed me. Oops. Yes?
There probably really isn't an answer to this, but what would motivate a woman to strap on a vest, pack the seat forward, walk into a marketplace? I mean, the man is martyred in heaven. Is that same thing motivate?
The question is, what would motivate a female suicide bomber? Pretty much the same thing that motivates a male suicide bomber. And I feel like we fixate on the 72 virgins thing and think, oh, these men are killing themselves so they can get reward in heaven. But there are plenty of religions that teach that you get reward in heaven, and not everybody is killing in that particular way. There are obviously different factors that sort of play into it, especially with certain conflicts in the world where, there's this perception that that's the only way that they can fight back because they don't have nuclear weapons and tanks or whatever. So they think that a human bomb is their most effective weapon. So what motivates a man to do that is the exact same thing as what motivates a woman generally. And women who die on the path in Allah's path, which is the war path, are also considered to be heaven-bound. And actually, there's an extra one for women. If a woman dies in childbirth or while nursing, she's considered to be as if she were a martyr on the battlefield. So it's not like only Muslim men get to go to heaven. Muslim women do too. So the idea there is that it is very similar. Yes? Or you go ahead.
So it seems like one of the main thrusts of what you've been talking about is how there is a diversity in terms of interpretations on sexuality and sex roles within Islam. And I'm wondering if there's varying kind of support for that, like if some interpretations are considered to be more valid than others within Islam.
So the question has to do with different ideas about sexuality and gender in Islam and whether or not certain ones are more supported by doctrine or not. Depends on who you ask. If you're going with strict literalism, the more strict views, the more hardline views are more valid. But then there's some Muslims who believe that the hadith, which are the sayings of Muhammad, are invalid entirely. Quran-only Muslims. And a lot of the really rank misogyny is found in the hadith more than the Quran itself. So by doing that, they sort of get rid of it. Or they'll say the hadith are not the most accurate, because the hadith is different from the Quran. So the Quran, Muhammad claimed it was revealed to him and he would say these words and people would memorize them or write them down, and that's the words we have today, allegedly. Whereas the hadith is a chain of transmission. You know, my uncle said, that his friend said, that his grandfather said, that his dog said, that his cat said, that his neighbor said, that Muhammad's wife said, that she heard Muhammad saying this one time that this. Like, I'm not even exaggerating. The chains of transmission are incredible. And then there were certain people that had reputations. So certain people who had reputations for exaggeration or lying or saying things to suit their own purposes. And so hadith actually have a ranking system of weak, questionable, strong, definitely, things like that. So, but because of that, some Muslims say, oh, either disregard the hadith entirely or take them with a grain of salt. And then there are some Muslims who, you know, latch onto certain verses and say, well, like Irshad Manji, who said Allah has created everything perfect, and I was born a lesbian, so that's perfection, and you're just going to have to deal with it. So yeah, there are different views, and there's a lot of Muslims walking around who don't know everything that's in their religion, and that's true for every religion. And I have been facing them more than ever because I have people who used to know me when I was Muslim, and they find out I'm not a Muslim, and they'll call me out of the blue and say, we haven't seen each other in a while, let's do lunch, and I know exactly what's coming. They're going to pay for my lunch so that I will sit there as they lecture me about what's so great about Islam. And all I'll have to do is cite one verse, and they'll look at me and go, that's not in the Quran. Yes, it is. Do you want me to bring it up? Oh, that's just, you know, culture or interpretation or at that time of history. To which my answer is, we're in a very different culture and time of history now. Can we just leave all that stuff behind? Why are we trying so hard to patch it all up, to make it work, when it clearly doesn't work anymore? They usually don't have very much to say to that. But yeah, I mean, despite the fact that Islam has this oneness narrative, and that comes from Muslims too, not just non-Muslims, and I'm the first to admit that. One God, one religion, one community. Despite that, they're all constantly at each other's throats about this stuff. You know, walk into a mosque and say one word, can you eat the hamburger at McDonald's, and just walk out. You will start a brawl. That's all you need to do. And in fact, in my book that's coming out, I have like chapters of like how to start a fight in a mosque. Like, there's these things that Muslims just love arguing about. Meat is a big one. Mortgages are another one. I call them the 4 M's: meat, modesty, mortgage, and music. Everyone will be at each other's throats. So this oneness narrative is kind of a lie. It's an illusion. And there's so much diversity within that. As much as Muslims try to tell non-Muslims that we're one community and we're all just Muslims. I was trained from a young age, by the way, this is a whole tangent, but I was trained from a young age that if a non-Muslim asked me if I was Shia or Sunni, I'd say, no, I'm a real Muslim. I'm a true Muslim. I don't believe in all these divisions. Even though at home my parents would be, not just my parents, I don't want to call them out, put them on blast, but I had a lot of relatives who'd say things like, you know, Shiites, they're not real Muslims. They pray on rocks. Just all this ridiculous stuff. So yeah, it's all over the place, and there's a lot more room for movement and change than I think people realize, or that even some Muslims want to admit. But you know, the first step to religious reform, I say all the time, is the apostates show up. Once you have people leaving your religion, suddenly you have to look at it and go, okay, how do we keep them in? How do we keep our kids from leaving? And usually the answer is reform and stop being so damn strict. And I see that happening in my own community. I am the counterexample. If you're too strict with your kids, they'll end up like Heina. Not actually what happened. I didn't leave Islam because it was too strict. I left Islam because it made no damn sense to me at a certain point. But you know, if that means that their kids get to have a much easier life, go ahead, use me as your biggie man. I don't mind. Yes?
I'm curious about the very liberal LGBT groups that you mentioned in college.
Mm-hmm.
Did they feel like they were on the verge of apostasy, or what was their attitude toward more fundamentalist Muslims, and how did they justify that distinction?
So the question is about LGBT Muslim groups and how they feel about religion and other Muslims and things like that. It's complicated for them usually. I mean, like, one of them was eating bacon. So clearly the rule against being gay wasn't the only rule that they were breaking. But then there are some Muslims who are actually quite conservative and yet LGBT and pro-LGBT, because they believe that the verse that's about allegedly homosexuality isn't about homosexuality for some reason, even though it's like, you know, they turn to their men unnaturally, but somehow that's about something else. I don't know. You know, you'd have to ask them, really. I don't see how they logic that one away. But some of them are really strict. They cover their heads, they fast, they pray, they everything, but, you know, they're gay. And some of them are celibate, so some of them will say, these are my desires, but I don't have to act on them because God says they're not good. Some of them are not celibate. Some of them, you know, have relationships. It runs the gamut. As far as fundamentalist Muslims, I mean, there's nobody a fundamentalist Muslim can harm more than their own community and fellow Muslims. And so, you know, there are plenty of Muslims, whether they're progressive, pro-LGBT or not, who don't exactly have a lot of warmth in their hearts for the more fundamentalist types, who they see as sort of ruining everything for them and making all the non-Muslims think that they're terrible and making their lives more difficult. So it's fairly complicated. But the group is called Masjid, the big one, MASGD, and they're worth looking up. They have a lot of writings and stuff that, if you're curious about it, would be a great place to look. Yes?
You had mentioned that mortgages was a point of, well, that can cause a dispute
Mm-hmm.
within a mosque. I know you might cover this, you mentioned that it might be, I guess, in your forthcoming, but would you mind elaborating ever so slightly? Because that.
Why would mortgages be a problem for Muslims? So you know how Jesus didn't like the moneylenders? Take that to a whole other level. In Islam, interest is prohibited. It's called riba and it's prohibited, straight up. So when my family earns interest on their bank accounts, they give it to charity because they can't spend it. Because the person who takes the money that they make from interest and buys food with it, that food is rendered unclean and forbidden, no matter what it is, even if it's the most halal thing on the planet. You know, blessed by every single person, doesn't matter. If you bought it with wrong money, then the food becomes bad. And so there are Muslims who believe that paying it is also prohibited, though, not just consuming it. And so mortgages come up because as a person in the United States, especially since Muslims tend to skew a little bit higher socioeconomically, they tend to be more educated and have a little bit more of an income, they tend to care about mortgages and want to buy a house as opposed to rent forever. And so some people say it's okay to buy one house and pay interest on that. And some people say, no, that's absolutely forbidden. And so now there's halal banking, where instead of charging you interest, the bank buys the house for you. Your quote-unquote down payment goes towards a portion of the house that is yours now, and then you pay rent on the rest of the house until you slowly own it somehow and pay it back. So it's basically a mortgage without the word interest or mortgage in it. And it actually ends up being much less economically good for whoever's getting the halal loan. But people do it because they want to follow the rules. But yeah, if you want to throw down at a mosque, say, which one of you has a mortgage? You're sinning. There will be a fight. Somebody will get angry. You're not a true Muslim, will be said. You're a hypocrite and an agent of the Zionist West. Although they don't say that to each other as much. Now they have ex-Muslims to point out to call us Zionist agents of the West who are trying to make Muslims look bad. That's a fun one. I'm still waiting for my check from the Zionist conspiracy. Everybody keeps telling me I've been bought and paid for, but where's my money? Rent to own, that's what it is, yeah. Actually, recently, a celebrated Pakistani journalist wrote an article about how ex-Muslims are seduced by Western Islamic phobia and how lucrative it is. And I tweeted at her saying, yo, where was that money when I was broke and my partner was homeless? Like, please advise. She didn't respond. I mean, I tried to be nice about it, but it's sort of odd to be told you're a paid agent. Not so much. I have a day job. This is not what I do. Any other questions? I'm going to take it from people who haven't asked first. Yes?
So you mentioned supporting progressive Islam.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have like ideas or
Well, I would say the first thing is sort of a shift in the way we talk and think about it. So instead of saying, ha ha, gay Muslims, that's an oxymoron, that's not real, or feminist Muslim, how does that even work? Like, instead of being smarmy about it, maybe try to learn. I think that's the first step. And, when conversations about people like that happen, speak up for them or point people to resources about it. I would say as someone who is outside of a Muslim community, that's the best thing someone can do, is just stop sort of condescending about it and stop sort of assuming the worst or assuming that it's not an existing thing. And if you're any kind of organizer, if you're involved with any like progressive groups or things like that, reach out to these groups because they're there and they're eager and they want to get involved with things, but nobody even wants to acknowledge that they exist. And as an ex-Muslim, I understand their frustrations. Because whenever I call for ex-Muslim representation, someone always shows up to tell me all ex-Muslims are dead or in hiding. And I have to sort of stick out my hand and say, hi, Heina Dadabhoy, out ex-Muslim, not dead. Not yet. If I am dead because of this, it'll just prove my point, so I'll be fine. I can live with that. Well, I wouldn't really be alive, but... All right, any other questions? You had one? Yeah.
So you have once you hit puberty, the prohibitions against shaking opposite sex non-relatives or even relatives' hands, and then you and your cousin went and did boy gazing on the first glance. If marriage is supposed to be a big deal until you get married, you can't do anything. How do you meet the people you're going to marry?
So the question is, with all the gender segregation, how do you meet the people you're going to marry? There's a million ways to do that. Mostly, though, I would say it's, you knew this boy at mosque and you grew up and you sometimes saw him in the entryway and maybe he'll send a proposal to your family or something. It really depends how it goes. Or if you're an MSA, like in the Muslim Student Union, so many MSA marriages have happened. It's a thing. Oh, and there's the big ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America. They do a big convention every year. People call it Club ISNA because in the hallways and in the vendor areas, there's a lot of halal flirting going on, and a lot of like, can I have your dad's email? I'm gonna send a letter. There's also sort of like informal arranged. People think of arranged marriages as your parents pick your spouse and you see them on your wedding day, and not so much. It's more like a global matchmaking service. When I started hitting like 17, my mom's like, oh, so what kind of boy should I start asking people to look for you? And so the idea, this happened to my cousins and I was there when it happened, so I could tell you exactly how it goes down. They'll figure out, they call them the boy and the girl, even if they're in their 40s. If they're unmarried and they're looking for a spouse, they're a boy and a girl, doesn't matter. And of course, there's no gay marriages being arranged this way, so unfortunately, this is very heteronormative. I know, right? Well, I feel like arranged same-sex marriages happen within the queer community because we're all looking out for each other, right? It's like, oh, this is my single friend. This is my single friend. At least with me. I mean, I try not to directly matchmake so that I'm not accountable for... I just invite everybody to my parties and you guys can meet each other and hook up if you want, but it's not my problem, not my responsibility. If he turns out to be a jerk to you, I'm sorry, just break up. But with Muslims, what they'll do, especially in my family, I've noticed this, is they'll say, oh, he's like, 26, done with his master's, and she's like 23, and she's done with her bachelor's, and has a job at a law office or something, and they're both about the same level of religiosity, so his beard isn't too long, and she only covers her head and not her face, so they're at about the same level. And, he's not very politically active, and she isn't. Okay, let's trade information. And this is a very Indian thing to do, by the way, too. It's not just Muslims who do this. There's the infamous biodata sheet, which is basically the precursor to the dating profile, where you write down your interests, your complexion, because for Indians that's a big deal, the skin tone. You don't want your dark child marrying a light child. Or no, you don't want your light child marrying a dark child. But if you have a dark child, you're looking for the lightest child possible so that your grandkids can be lighter. It's really screwed up. That's its whole own thing. But yeah, you have skin tone, interests, education level, age, how many kids they want to have, if they want to have pets, A lot of them are very similar to what you fill out in a dating profile. A little something about them, what their favorite subject was in school, a picture, often, a very nicely taken glamour shot, to show off to the best advantage. And so they'll trade the information. These days, sometimes they might, even if there's an interest, just give each of the people an email address. Be like, hey, my friend knows this really nice boy, and he's about your age, and he seems like the type of boy you'd want to marry, so here's the email. And sometimes, in the very modern sense these days, these people will meet up even before their families meet up. But if you're kicking it more old school, if you're being a little more traditional, then instead of that, usually the girl's family will invite the boy's family over for dinner, and she'll come out dressed as traditionally as possible, her eyes down, so that she looks all modest. And it's always samosas. That's what's always served. It's always damn samosas. And they always claim that she made them, even if it was really her grandma. And there's tea and samosas, and they chat. And then, everyone leaves the room except for the boy and the girl, or the boy and the girl are allowed to go to like an adjoining room, but no doors closed, of course. And they'll chat up and decide whether or not they want to marry each other, right then and there. Or sometimes they might go on a few like informal dates or something like that. And then they decide to get married or not, and then the date is set, and that's how it goes. But yeah, that's how it's done. Unless you meet a boy at school or MSA or work or something, or in a bookstore like my cousin did. Actually, this is a great example of what people don't think about when they think about Muslim women, because my cousin met her future husband at an Islamic bookshop. She at the time had her full face covering on. So this man had never seen her face, but they texted and emailed for years. And Islamically speaking, if a woman covers her face, if you're a man and you're engaged to her, like with serious intentions of marrying her, you're not only allowed to ask to see her without her face covering, you're allowed to see her without her head covering. And she asked him if he wanted to, and he says, no, I love you regardless of what you look like. Yeah, which is almost the most romantic thing I've ever heard. I mean, and they're doing great now. Obviously, he thinks she's pretty. They've been married for a while now, and they're very happy. But yeah, I mean, there's this weird... People find a way to make it work. People find a way to make it work for themselves, and that's probably the sweetest example of all the ones I know. Whereas, the rest of us are like, we got to test drive the car before we buy it. For like 3 years at least. Good night, everybody.